Somewhere between continents, Love was learning a new language. Not a language of accents or passports, but of loss, healing, and quiet, stubborn hope. This is the story of an African man who lost his country without ever leaving it, and an American woman who lost herself in a land that was meant to save her. Ayo Adekunle never wanted to leave Nigeria. He loved Lagos, the noise, the beautiful chaos, the way the city fought you and embraced you in the same breath. He studied civil engineering, believing he could build things that would outlast corruption and broken promises. But life had other plans. His father died suddenly. His mother fell ill. Responsibility arrived long before success. Projects failed, contracts vanished into the maw of politics, and dreams that once felt so solid began to feel like smoke. By 34, Ayo was still brilliant, still capable, but he was exhausted. He wore his disappointment like a second skin. So, when a construction firm in Morocco offered him a short-term contract, he took it, not as an escape, but for a little distance from the pain. He didn't know he was traveling toward his second chance. Meanwhile, Emily Carter came to Africa running. Back home in Seattle, her life looked perfect on paper. A graduate degree, a good job, a marriage that everyone approved of. But behind closed doors, her world was quietly collapsing. The divorce was polite, bloodless, and utterly devastating. She booked a humanitarian project in North Africa, hoping that physical distance could somehow blur the ache in her heart. She wanted to be somewhere so unfamiliar that her pain wouldn't recognize the streets. She arrived with a suitcase full of clothes and a heart full of questions she wasn't ready to answer. They met on a construction site, under the relentless Moroccan sun. Ayo was supervising drainage work. Emily was documenting community projects. Their first conversation was brief, professional, and entirely forgettable. But fate is a patient thing. They kept crossing paths, at meetings, at shared transport stops, at a small cafe that served coffee far too strong for comfort. Slowly, conversation grew between them. It wasn't flirtation, it was recognition. They spoke about failure without trying to decorate it. They talked about the crushing weight of expectations and the terrifying fear of starting over when you feel like time is running out. There was no performance between them, no pretense. Just honesty. Their connection was slow and careful, like two people gently touching old wounds instead of skin. Around Emily, Ayo didn't feel inferior or like some exotic story she needed to save. Around Ayo, Emily didn't feel judged. He never asked her to explain her sadness. He just accepted it. They shared easy laughter and comfortable silences. Love arrived without any grand announcement. But reality arrived much faster. Emily's project was ending. Ayo's contract was temporary. Passports, visas, and responsibilities stood between them like silent guards at a border they couldn't cross. They didn't promise each other forever. They promised truth. Emily returned to America, and the distance was brutal. Time zones replaced touch. Video calls became a poor substitute for presence. Love, which had felt so natural, now felt like hard work. Then, Ayo received news that his mother's health was failing. Emily's career demanded her complete focus. They tried. They really tried. But sometimes, trying isn't enough. They ended it quietly, without blame or anger. Both returned to their separate lives, carrying something precious and fragile they couldn't quite name. Back in Nigeria, Ayo found a renewed sense of clarity. He started small, taking on local contracts, focusing on honest, meaningful work. He built schools, drainage systems, and roads that genuinely mattered to his community. Slowly, his reputation grew. He was building his country, just as he'd always dreamed. Emily stayed in America, but she was different. She stopped chasing the illusion of perfection. She volunteered with a new purpose, loved more openly, and lived with a raw honesty she'd learned in a land far from home. They didn't talk, but they remembered. 5 years passed. Emily returned to Africa for a conference in Ghana. And there, on the list of keynote speakers, was a name she knew, Ayo Adekunle. When they saw each other across the crowded room, everything else just disappeared. They were no longer the broken people who had met in Morocco. They were no longer running from their pasts. They talked for hours, walked for miles, and laughed with a freedom they hadn't felt in years. This time, love wasn't fragile. It wasn't uncertain. It was ready. They chose each other, not out of loneliness or need, but from a place of strength, wholeness, and undeniable hope. They carried a newfound clarity. Love no longer felt like an escape. It felt like an agreement, a mutual understanding. They moved slowly, deliberately. There were no dramatic confessions under the moonlight, no reckless promises whispered in the dark. Instead, their love was built on shared mornings, long walks through bustling streets, and conversations that stretched well past midnight, blurring into the dawn. They were rediscovering each other, piece by piece, layer by layer. They talked about the future, about children whose identities would confuse forms and databases, children who would be a beautiful blend of cultures. They spoke of homes that would never feel fully American or fully African, but would, most importantly, feel honest. For the first time in their lives, love didn't demand a sacrifice. It offered balance, a sense of wholeness. Emily made her decision. She would relocate permanently. She broke the news to her family in careful conversations, conversations filled with long pauses and unspoken worry. They asked the questions you'd expect, about safety, about the culture shock, about the immense distance. She answered each one calmly, without a hint of defensiveness. "I've been lonely in familiar places," she told them. "I'd rather be full in an unfamiliar one." Ao watched her courage with a quiet awe. He saw the strength it took for her to uproot her life, not for him, but for them. They began planning a wedding, one that deliberately refused spectacle. No grand gesture had earned them this love. Time had. Patience had. So they chose dates. They picked out colors. They talked about which city would feel most like home. For a moment, it seemed like life itself was nodding in approval, giving them a gentle push forward. And then, the offer came. It arrived without warning, like a sudden shift in the wind. Ao was offered the chance to oversee a multi-state infrastructure project. This wasn't just a job, it was a legacy. It was the kind of opportunity that could define his entire career and rewrite his country's story in small, but deeply meaningful ways. It was everything he had ever prayed for, and it was everything that demanded distance. He struggled silently, carrying the weight of this impossible choice like a hidden guilt. But Emily saw it in his eyes before he ever spoke a word. She saw the conflict, the passion, the responsibility. "Go," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't survive losing you once just to stand in the way of who you re-becoming." So they agreed on patience once more. But this wasn't the fragile, uncertain patience of their youth. This was a confident patience, rooted in trust and a deep, unwavering love. Distance returned to their lives, but it was gentler this time, less of a monster. Voice notes replaced their bedtime routines. Laughter traveled across oceans through crackling phone lines. Their plans were revised, but never, ever abandoned. Emily began packing up her apartment, slowly, deliberately. She labeled each box for a life that felt so real she could almost touch it. A life that was waiting for her across the sea. Meanwhile, Ao drove endlessly. His car kicked up dust on roads that curled through the intense heat. He moved between construction sites, buzzing with the promise of a better future. He spoke to communities, he supervised teams, and he stayed up late into the night, poring over plans and blueprints. He was exhausted, but he was deeply, profoundly fulfilled. Their love felt steady, solid, and secure. And that is exactly how fate prefers its victims, unguarded. The accident didn't make the headlines. There was no breaking news story. It happened on a quiet highway, on a day that felt no more dangerous than any other. A fuel tanker lost control. Ao's car had nowhere to go. Fire, as we know, does not negotiate. Emily was at home, choosing curtains for their future life, when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, trained to soften the blow of absolute disaster. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat down, slowly, as if grief needed her permission to enter the room. Nigeria welcomed Emily with the dry harmattan dust and an unbearable, suffocating stillness. The hospital room smelled of chemicals and finality. The machines that had been keeping a body alive were now silent. The man she loved lay there, untouched by time, because time had stopped needing him. She reached out and touched his hand. It was cold. The funeral followed tradition, a powerful wave of drums, prayers, and collective mourning. Emily stood there, an outsider caught between cultures, between a sense of belonging and the most profound loss imaginable. As the earth covered Ao's body, a devastating realization washed over her. She had crossed an entire ocean to build a life, and she had arrived only in time to bury it. But Emily stayed. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She visited every single project that Ao had touched. She walked the very roads that he had helped build. She met the people whose lives he had changed, people who spoke his name with a reverence and gratitude that was both comforting and heartbreaking. She learned something cruel and beautiful in that process. Ao had lived long enough to truly matter. Years later, Emily returned to America. She never replaced him. You don't replace a love like that. Instead, she carried him. She carried him in the way she saw the world, in the strength she discovered within herself, and in the quiet understanding that some loves are not meant to last a lifetime, but are powerful enough to define one. Years had passed since Ao died, but grief still followed Emily Carter like a shadow that knew her name. She had survived, but survival, she learned, was not the same thing as living. It's a lesson that hits you hard, isn't it? The world keeps spinning, but a part of you is just stuck. Emily was 42 when the letter arrived. She lived in Portland, in a modest house near the river. Her life was respectable. She lectured on international development, mentored young volunteers, and when she spoke about Africa, it was with a tenderness that always surprised her audience. She never remarried. It wasn't because she couldn't love again, but because the love she'd known had completely rearranged her soul. Every year, on the anniversary of Ao's death, she made a quiet trip back to Africa. No big announcements, no one to witness her pilgrimage. Just her and the memory of him. But this year felt different. There was a shift in the air, a hum of anticipation she couldn't quite place. Then came the letter. It had a Nigerian postmark, and the paper felt thin, like it had traveled a long way. Inside, a single, cryptic sentence. "If you are still breathing, please come." No signature, no explanation, just those words. Something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with a strange, deep sense of recognition. As if she'd been waiting for this message her entire life. Without a second thought, Emily booked the flight that night. The address on the envelope led her to a modest office complex in Ibadan. The air was thick with the familiar sense of dust and rain. She walked in, her heart pounding a rhythm against her ribs. Inside, a woman in her early 30s stood waiting. Her eyes were cautious, her hands trembling slightly as she held them clasped in front of her. "My name is Zara Adekunle," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I am Ao's daughter." The room tilted. Emily felt the floor drop away, and she quickly sat down before her legs failed her completely. Ao's daughter? He had never mentioned a child. Not once in all their years together. The silence stretched between them, filled with a million unspoken questions. Zara began to explain, slowly, carefully. Ao had fathered her in his early 20s, long before his life took a different turn, before shame and circumstance convinced him that keeping his distance was a form of kindness. He had supported her quietly, anonymously, watching her grow up from afar, a ghost in his own daughter's life. It was a story of sacrifice, of a love so deep it chose silence over disruption. Before he died, Ao had left behind a set of instructions. A final, desperate plan. If Emily ever returned to Nigeria, and 5 years had passed since his death, Zara was to find her. He had created a bridge between the two most important women in his life, a bridge built on trust and time. Listening to Zara, Emily didn't feel a sting of betrayal. Instead, a profound sense of being entrusted with something sacred washed over her. It was as if Ao had handed her the most precious part of himself. Zara spoke with her father's cadence, that same thoughtful rhythm. She had his restraint, his quiet gentleness. Emily saw him everywhere, in the way Zara asked questions, in her immense patience, in the heavy sense of responsibility she carried on her young shoulders. It was like looking at a living echo of the man she had loved so fiercely. And then, Zara revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Ao had not died without preparing for the future. He had secretly established a foundation, funded through the projects he'd worked on throughout his life. Its mission was to support young engineers and fund infrastructure development in underserved communities across Nigeria. It was his life's work, his dream for his country, distilled into a tangible legacy. And in his will, he had named Emily as the final trustee. He had trusted her, even after all this time, to see his unfinished work through to the end. That's when Emily knew she couldn't just visit anymore. She stayed in Nigeria, not permanently, but purposefully. She and Zara, two women bound by one man's love, began to work together. They expanded the foundation. They poured their energy into Ao's dream. Roads were built where there had only been dirt tracks. Schools rose from the ground, their walls echoing with the laughter of children. Entire communities began to shift, to hope, to build. Emily never had children of her own, but in a way, she inherited a legacy far bigger than she could have imagined. And as she worked alongside Zara, building Ao's dream forward, brick by brick, she realized something extraordinary. The love she thought she had lost hadn't ended with his death. It had simply evolved. It had transformed. Some people don't stay in our lives forever, but they stay in our work. They stay in the purpose they leave behind for us. And sometimes, love doesn't return as romance. It returns as responsibility. It returns as a chance to continue a story that you thought was over. For Emily, loving Ao once meant sharing a life with him. Now, loving him meant building his legacy. And in doing so, she finally learned the difference between surviving and truly, deeply living. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please consider liking and subscribing for more content that explores the incredible ways love shapes our lives.